Hello, everybody, and welcome to Right Here, Right Now, live Buffalo football talk presented by Forefathers Organics. I'm your host, Alex Brasky, here for the Batavia Daily and Livingston County News. Each week, we'll discuss Buffalo's favorite football team, along with all the comings and goings from Orchard Park. And as always, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Forefathers Organics in Dansville.
Unlock the power of nature with Forefathers Organics, your premium CBD store. We offer the highest quality CBD and hemp products to liberate your mind, body, and soul, helping you live happy and free. Our mission is driven by excellence and transparency, using cutting-edge scientific methods to combat stress and target issues at their source. From potent ingestible CBD to soothing topicals, all our products are USDA certified organic. Discover all natural wellness from farm to table. Visit forefathersorganics.com for more information.
All right, welcome in. Took a week off last week. We are back with Right Here, Right Now, live Buffalo football talk. And our guest today, Chris Trapasso of CBS Sports, will break down the NFL draft and how the Bills are most likely looking at things entering the selection process. Chris does a great job on his draft coverage and much more in-depth than I can provide you in terms of analysis. So happy to have him come on in just a few moments. But before we bring Chris in, some big news in terms of the Bills, or relatively big news. The Bills will be back at St. John Fisher University for training camp this summer, a 24th season. They've missed 2 years due to the COVID-19 pandemic a few years ago, but the Bills will return to St. John Fisher for the 24th time this summer. Exact details of the camp still being determined. Schedule likely to be released later this spring, but it's always a good thing for the fans to have the Bills return to St. John Fisher. Really great access for the fans, as I watched Mike Catalana's video here from his report a few days ago. The fans really spill over onto the track there at St. John Fisher University, get to interact with the players, get some autographs. So always a great thing to return to St. John Fisher University, and I'm sure the fans are very happy about that as well. But without further ado, let's bring in our guest, Chris Trapasso of CBS Sports. And Chris, we bring you in to talk about the draft, but first and foremost, how are things going for you? A little bit of a welfare check. I know you've probably spread yourself a little bit thin, dating back to as soon as really the postseason ended, and now trending toward the draft. So welfare check. How you doing, my friend?
Everything's pretty good in my life right now with when it comes to work. That this is a fun time of the year. I like to jump on as many of these podcasts as possible, especially with the local guys. I've seen you at St. John Fisher camp. We've talked a lot, and I've told you, you're my go-to beat writer for following like the play-by-play of camp. I know some people are like, oh, why are you doing play-by-play? I think it's very valuable. I love it. So when I'm not at St. John Fisher College, I love to follow you, Alex. So I'm very honored to be on this podcast to talk NFL draft and what is probably going to be a very monumental draft for the Bills, with the amount of picks that they have, the clear holes on defense, and the fact that the Super Bowl window is still wide open.
Very kind words from you to start off the podcast. It's only 10:08 and my head is swelling now, but no, it's something I like to do at training camp, just because I know over the years, as the Bills have become more and more successful, used to be able to pick up training camp tickets for free at Wilson Farms, for those of you who remember what Wilson Farms is. And now you can't even get a ticket to training camp on some days. So I like to provide the people a little bit of an inside look. You can only stay within certain parameters. The team sort of limits you there, but we do our best to bring the people as good a coverage as we possibly can. And speaking of which, we will bring you that today on the podcast. And a lot of draft talk lately surrounding the Bills, but I wanted to start this podcast discussing some of the offseason moves that the Bills have made over the past few weeks and really months. Joey Bosa, the headliner among them, an aging player, still only 29 years old, but when you look at his injury history, maybe a little bit older than his age would indicate, just due to the wear and tear on his body. But how do you view that move? I look at it as a low-risk, high-reward move. You bring him in here on a one-year deal, relatively low cost, judging on the player's track record in terms of what he can produce at his top level. So I think Brandon Beane, a quality move here, bringing in a player that you don't commit as much to as you did Von Miller a few years ago. So a low-risk, high-reward move is how I view this. Do you think this is a move that could potentially take that pass rush to the next level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when the Bills signed Von Miller, so much of it was about finding that closer, the guy that in late games, Brandon Beane spoke to this, Sean McDermott spoke to this, that can end the game with a big strip sack or just to take the quarterback down on a key third down in the fourth quarter. I think Joey Bosa still has that ability. You're right that he's probably a little bit older than what his age ultimately says, that he's only 29 years old. But what I do like from the Bills' perspective, and you certainly have to speak to and think of and consider the injury history. But I like that he's not coming off an injury in 2024, that he had big injuries in 22 and 23 and was mostly healthy down the stretch. And down the stretch is where we saw Joey Bosa play like the Joey Bosa who was, a perennial Pro Bowl or All-Pro type player, one of the top 5 to 7 pass rushers in the league earlier in his career. So Von Miller last season played about 25% of the snaps. Joey Bosa was up 42% for the Chargers last year. And I think if he's playing between 30 to 45% of the snaps for the Bills and kind of ramps up in December and January, it feels like, everyone should agree with this, that he gives the Bills that pass rushing juice and the speed at which he can get to the quarterback that this defense just did not have the last 2 seasons.
And I bring up this stat from his career dating back to his rookie season. Each year he started 11 games or more, he's produced 10.5 sacks or more. So if he's able to stay on the field for the Bills, I really think that could be a boon for this pass rush. But we might see him on the field a little bit more often than maybe was expected. I know that the Bills were aware of Michael Hoyt's suspension before they brought him in, but with him out for the first 6 games, maybe Bosa a little bit more 3-down duty. We'll see how that works out. But how do you view the PED suspensions for both Michael Hoyt and Larry Ogunjobi? Some are maybe, I would say, overreacting to the suspension. Some may be playing it down a little bit too much. I'm more kind of in the middle. I understand that this is a playoff team. You're playing for December and January and perhaps February, but to bring in 2 players and not be aware that one was facing a suspension, just not a good look for this front office, and something that I'm sure was regrettable for Brandon Beane bringing in Larry Ogunjobi. He kind of referenced that during his time at the podium a couple of weeks ago, saying that they probably wouldn't have brought in 2 guys on a suspension had they known, but by the time they were made aware of Ogunjobi's suspension, it was kind of too late in the game, and the options out there were nil. But do you think this is as big of a deal as some are making it seem, or do you think it's as little of a deal as some are making it seem? Or are you with me kind of somewhere in the middle?
I think it's mostly an overreaction, but I do think you bring up a good point that the whole Larry Ogunjobi thing, where like the Bills didn't know, it's not a good look for the front office. And and you're probably, if you're the Bills, you're a little miffed at Ogunjobi and his agent for not disclosing that during the free agent process, that maybe the Bills had targets higher on their free agent board at defensive tackle that they ultimately would have gone after, maybe harder, maybe upped some of the money for those players. So from that perspective, just Ogunjobi, I think, yes, it is not a good look for the Bills. But overall, those 2 players not playing the first 6 games, what you said, that this team is certainly to the point in terms of the roster building and all of that, that it's December, January, and potentially February, what matters most for this team. And if anything, to keep those players from clearly not getting hurt in those first 6 games where they're not going to be on the field and being more fresh later in the season, I think it could actually work in the Bills' favor. We've seen guys like Jameson Williams on the Lions served a suspension, I think 2 years ago, and it seemed at the time like, oh man, what are the Lions going to do offensively? And then he was healthier and more ready to go later in the season. So I kind of feel the same way about this, that it's not nothing, but mostly an overreaction. Just that there was a lot of buzz and momentum and hype. Like, look at what the Bills have done in free agency. And then when you say, oh, 2 of the players they signed are going to be not on the field for the first 6 games of the season, it kind of dampers things. But I think when we'll step back and look at the Bills 2025 season, those 6-game suspensions will not be much of a blip on the radar.
Yeah, I think it being such a position of need, the defensive line has been a point of contention with Brandon Beane and the fan base over the past few years, have never really been able to produce that pass rush or that run stopping ability that they've been trying to provide this defense over the past few years. And bringing in those 2 players, the Bills fan base was hoping that that would help satisfy some of the shortcomings from this defense in the past. But guess they're going to have to wait till week 7 to perhaps see some of that materialize. But I think maybe a good thing in the sense that you do get to see Dwayne Carter out there perhaps a little bit more. You do perhaps get to see Javon Solomon out there a bit more, and maybe that ramps up their progression early in their career. So you got to look on the bright side with some of these things. Last thing in terms of the offseason, or 2 more things, excuse me. First and foremost, Joshua Palmer. Will that preclude them from drafting a wide receiver high in the draft? And what does he bring to the table? Obviously, that separation ability is fantastic, but what else could he bring to the table for this offense? And do you think that will preclude them from taking a wide receiver early as they did last year?
All right, I'll answer that first question about the draft and how it impacts it. I think it does preclude them from picking a wide receiver with one of those first 3 picks, obviously the first rounder and then the 2 in the second round. But I don't think that the addition of Josh Palmer means that they will not pick a receiver whatsoever. I think because of Keon Coleman's shaky rookie season, Curtis Samuel not necessarily living up to the free agent, I don't want to say hype because he only signed a deal for $8 million per year last year, but he wasn't a big part of the offense in his first season in Buffalo. To maybe plan ahead with a 4th or one of those 3 5th rounders, I wouldn't be surprised if the Bills do add another receiver. But because Palmer does give them exactly what this offense was missing. Now, it's not Devontae Adams. It's not someone who's going to funnel 150 targets, obviously, to him. But they needed an outside separator who could win down the field with speed, with contested catch ability, and even in that back shoulder game. We saw a little bit of that from Mac Hollins down the stretch and in the playoffs. But Josh Palmer at 25 with 4.50 speed, and really him moving into that specialty role of being a vertical threat with the Chargers and Justin Herbert. That's exactly what the Bills needed last season. And I think they understood that had to be something that needed to be an added element to this offense.
All right. And I had one more thing about the offseason. Maybe we'll wait to get to that on the other side. But we talk about wide receiver early in the draft. And one of my draft crushes, I don't consider myself a draft guru, but I follow especially the top end of the draft a little bit more closely than deep. And Matthew Golden really stuck out to me even before he ran that speedy time at the NFL scouting combine. Just what he did at Texas, not a incredible high production guy, but a touchdown scorer, somebody that can get open down the field using his speed. And Jonathan asks or says he doesn't think that they're going to draft at 30. And you say that Joshua Palmer move would preclude them from taking a wide receiver. But if you could humor me and tell me what the Bills would have to do to perhaps move up and have a chance at drafting Matthew Golden. It doesn't seem like he's going to drop to number 30. I think maybe that was in the cards before he ran that time, but maybe he's moving himself up the ladder. But feel free to correct me if I'm viewing it incorrectly.
No, you're spot on with that, Alex. That I always say, and it's kind of a known thing with the draft now, that the first round is all about traits. And for as much as teams say, oh, we don't look at the 40, we don't. Yes, they do. They care about 40-yard dash time. They care about. I mean, certainly we saw this year with the Combine IQ through NFL.com that we got to see the miles per hour that these players were running the 40. And maybe teams are looking at that a little bit more than the 40-yard dash. But in general, vertical, 3-cone, broad jump, measurables, that's the predominance of what you will see in the first round in terms of prospects. Now, I'll say I did not see 4.29 with Matthew Golden on film. Like, he wasn't repeatedly running away from players in the SEC last season, which you would think 4.29 would do that. But to move up, the Bills would probably have to go into 2026. It obviously would depend on how high they ultimately would try to be moving. If they're trying to go from 30 into the, say, 20 to 22, maybe they would have to part with that second round pick. I don't think they would love to do that. They don't have a third rounder at this point. They can maybe trade 2 or 3 picks. Maybe that's one of the 4th rounders or one of the 5th rounders to move up to get him. But yes, he would bring speed. And even though he is a little bit smaller, he does have a history of playing on the outside, which it feels like with Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel, and maybe a move more into the slot for Keon Coleman, that the Bills, again, have that need beyond Josh Palmer at the other outside wide receiver position entering the 2025 season.
How about Xavier Restrepo? And this will be my last question on wide receivers, and then maybe touch on some of the guys that you view. You said that you don't think they'll take one early. Maybe touch on some of the guys that you have in mind maybe for the Bills late in the draft. But Xavier Restrepo runs, I believe, a 4.8 at his pro day yesterday. A lot of people down on him now. But that's not really his game. His game is getting open at the top of the route, a route running technician, a hard-nosed player. Are you as down on people after – are you as down on Xavier Restrepo as people are after running that slow time? Or do you think that's something he's going to be able to overcome? And then if you could, touch on some of the guys – along with Restrepo that the Bills might be able to get later in the draft.
Well, I watched Restrepo before Miami's pro day on Tuesday, and I was reasonably low on him. I don't know if I saw 4.80 on film, but I didn't see someone that could really threaten cornerbacks with his speed down the field. So they were sitting on a lot of his underneath routes. But I will say, to what you spoke to, Restrepo can get open, and he's very reliable catching the football, even though he has very short arms, doesn't have big hands, not a big target. He's kind of uniquely sized at like 5'9" and over 200 pounds. He's built like a running back, really. Pretty good after the catch as well. But I feel like with the 4.78 and the 4.80, late day 3 most likely for him, that, or even undrafted, because I think teams see that and go, man, I don't know if with so many other athletic specimens in this class, we've seen it time and time again where a bad combine or a bad pro day will push players significantly further down the board or off the board completely relative to where they should ultimately be picked if we're just watching them as football players. So he's not the type for me that I think the Bills need, because he's a slot only type, but the separation ability could maybe attract the Bills. Again, kind of staying with the idea that they need someone that can play on the perimeter, can still get open. Torrey Horton from Colorado State reminds me a lot of Rashad Bateman when he was coming out of Minnesota. He obviously went in the first round, battled injuries, but we saw him really produce in 2024 with Lamar Jackson. Torrey Horton's tall, like 6'1", 6'2", kind of spindly, very good athlete. He's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of Restrepo, where he tested very well at the combine, ran sub 4.5, good vertical, good broad jump, and multiple years at Colorado State as like the Stephon Diggs of that offense. The entire offense was funneled through him, ran the entire route tree. He's kind of a favorite of mine. If the Bills ultimately wanted to pick a wide receiver, like say in the 4th round or 5th round, maybe he would even be picked a little earlier than that. A few others, Isaiah Bond from Texas, and he's kind of infamous for saying he's going to break Xavier Worthy's record at the combine in the 40-yard dash. Doesn't do that, but he still ran 4.39. So it's not like he, severely disappointed in a vacuum. He still
didn't pull a Restrepo.
He didn't pull a Restrepo. He did not run 4.8. He ran 4.39. And what I like about Isaiah Bond, even though he's a little bit smaller, he's in this new mold of wide receivers that play on the outside in college and are like 5'10", 185 pounds, 5'11", 5'10", somewhere in that range. Can play on the outside, show the ability to beat press, and he's a very savvy route runner in that the athleticism does it for him, but he uses shoulder fakes, head fakes, really sells that he's running a post, but it's actually a corner. The route running nuance, I think he learned it at Alabama, took it with him to Texas. So those two players, I feel like, fit what the Bills need: more juice vertically and can get open, and the kind of cherry on top, have experience dealing with press coverage, playing that outside wide receiver role.
All right, good stuff at wide receiver. Now let's move to cornerback, perhaps more of a position of need for the Bills. They don't really have a cornerback 2 in tow right now. Maybe Dane Jackson suited or slated to fill that role if the Bills don't acquire anybody worth entering that mix this offseason. But is that the position that you're looking for with the Bills at the top of the draft? And then if so, maybe highlight some prospects. I know Trey Amos is a player that a lot of Bills fans are coveting this early in the draft process, and I'm not sure where he would fall in the draft. But how important is this position to address in the draft? Do you think the Bills are going to use multiple picks to address this position? And maybe at the end, is there any chance Rasul Douglas comes back?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. I think when it comes to corner, technically, yes, the Bills, that is a glaring need. But I want to, at this point, with Brandon Beane being in his 7th draft with the Bills and Sean McDermott having been in Buffalo since 2017. Now, I get it that Trey White was Sean McDermott's first draft pick and turned into an all-pro corner, was a captain, a leader of the team in his prime. But I kind of look back at the history of drafting that the Bills have done and how they've plugged in specific players and invested in certain roles on offense, on defense. They've really stayed away from wide receiver for the most part early, outside of Keon Coleman last year. And cornerback, they've gone through Dane Jackson and Levi Wallace. They had Josh Norman late in his career on the roster. So I don't want to say that the Bills don't prioritize the cornerback spot, but it always has felt like Sean McDermott and now Bobby Babich at defensive coordinator feel like they can kind of patchwork that position. It's kind of the same with safety too, where they don't necessarily need high investments to get the requisite results from that position. So yes, Trey Amos reminds me a lot of Tyson Campbell, who signed a multi-year extension last season with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's tall, he's fast, ran sub 4.5 at the combine from the SEC. Just quality player on film. There's nothing really stand out about his game or his traits, but he ticks a lot of the boxes. And it kind of feels like Trey Amos will be available at the end-ish of the first round. One other player that I think could be of interest for the Bills, who's really flying under the radar because he did not work out at the combine, Azareye'h Thomas, the cornerback from Florida State. Now, the Seminoles had a down year, but if you just look at the traits and watch the film from Thomas, almost 6'2", almost 200 pounds. He has long arms, can play man-to-man coverage, and maybe the Bills are starting to shift toward featuring more man coverage in their defense, or at least blending some of that with the zone-heavy concepts that they've mostly had. He reminds me a lot of Jalen Watson, who didn't play a lot last season in Kansas City, but has been that press man, long-armed cornerback that when he's been on the field early in his career, he and Joshua Williams in Kansas City have been two of the better young tandems that came into the league at the same time, 2022, and can play on the outside and can play man coverage. So Azareye'h Thomas is one I wanted to highlight. Not getting a lot of buzz in Bills circles or among Bills fans, but feels like that late first rounder, early second round type talent that can play man, is long, and ticks a lot of the measurable boxes that I think maybe the Bills are going to be after with their cornerback too.
Yeah, I'm certainly guilty of this as well. But the Bills fan base, when they get their thoughts on a player, especially high in the draft, they really go all out about that player. And Kenneth Grant has really been that player that Bills fans have had their minds on. And I wanted to ask you about defensive tackle, but running out of time here. Final question I want to ask you about is Brandon Beane's draft history and how it's been viewed after the failure, I would say, of Kaiir Elam and what's trending toward perhaps a failure with Dalton Kincaid. I know he had the great rookie season, a major step back in year 2, dealt with some injury trouble. And then Keon Coleman, some up and down from him during his rookie year. So how do you view Brandon Beane's draft history, particularly at the top end of the draft? He's had some hits in round 1. I think he's had a little bit more success maybe in the middle rounds, round 3. He's really had a lot of big hits, but is it as worrisome as some players are, or as some fans are making it seem? I know that I'm somebody of the thought that I wouldn't hesitate to trade some of those picks at the top end of the draft just due to some of that history that Brandon Beane has had, taking a Kaiir Elam, Dalton Kincaid, the fit that he's had on this offense, Keon Coleman, whether or not that was the right pick. So I was kind of full on the side of F them picks, go after a Trey Hendrickson, go after a Myles Garrett, somebody to help this pass rush. But now that you're bringing Joey Bosa, maybe that's less of an opportunity. But are you as worried with Brandon Beane's ability at the top end of the draft as some of the fans are? Or do you think it's more of a kind of a mixed bag from Beane over the course of his time as Bills GM?
Well, what I would say is that, and it's easy to get sucked into the first round and the top 30 to 40 players. And, obviously Thursday night, first round, April 24th, the ratings are going to be through the roof. But I always urge people, and maybe I'm saying this from a hugely biased perspective as a draft analyst, that the draft does not end in round one. And the Bills are one of the Bills, and I would say the Rams, if you look at the history of those two teams over the last 10 plus years, how many gems they have found rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, even into round 6 with Christian Benford. It's really important to stay plugged in as much as you can, or at least pop in when you know the Bills are getting ready to pick on day 2 and even on day 3. So I think Brandon Beane would be the first one to say that, yeah, in general, his first round selections really after Josh Allen, Ed Oliver the following year have not been up to the level that they probably need to be. I mean, Greg Rousseau, 21 was good, but yeah, there have been some early round misses, Cody Ford being another. But from what I just mentioned, he understands, his scouting staff understands that, you can find a Khalil Shakir and a James Cook and a Terrell Bernard later in the draft, that it's certainly not done on Thursday night. I was kind of with you when it came to either Myles Garrett or Trey Hendrickson or maybe even Micah Parsons, not because of my philosophy that I just think like, hey, this guy hasn't hit on first rounders, so just trade all of them. But just because Josh Allen is entering his age 29 season and the Super Bowl window is wide open, but I don't think it's open for the next 10 to 15 years like someone like, with CJ Stroud or with Jaden Daniels that those organizations could feel. But it's certainly the only negative that I would say that you can easily take from Brandon Beane's history is that it's great to hit on a Khalil Shakir, and a Christian Benford has become one of the best young corners in the NFL, Terrell Bernard, that usually when you're missing on first rounders, you're missing on those legitimate, like game wrecking potential Hall of Fame type players, because it's very, very difficult to find them in round 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That Khalil Shakir is a fantastic player. But he's not necessarily someone that is a wide receiver 1 that's going to be an all-pro. I mean, maybe with development, he can continue his kind of upward-facing arrow that he's been on since he was a rookie. But when you're missing the first rounders, you're missing on the TJ Watts and the Micah Parsons, those type of players. That would really be the only negative that I would take. I think overall, Brandon Beane's track record is one of the better drafting GMs in the NFL.
Yeah, like you said, the first round, it's all about traits, and that's what you look at when you look at a Myles Garrett level player, somebody who can really wreck the game. You look at those traits and that physical strength, the speed off the edge, and that's what you miss when you draft and look for those players later in the draft. But look no further than all the extensions that they've been giving out this offseason, homegrown players that Brandon Beane has brought in through the draft. I certainly have my doubts with him at the top end of the draft, but if you look at, like you said, the entirety of his track record, especially in the later rounds, middle of the later rounds, he's certainly been successful and set this team up for success. And that's not even to mention a Christian Benford or a James Cook, who are still in search of contract extensions. I think that might have to wait until maybe next offseason, the way things are trending right now. Maybe Benford looking to follow up his successful 2024 season with another big season in 2025 and set himself up for a generational payday. And then James Cook has already made his demands, I'll say, relatively clear through social media. But Chris, final question. What's going to take this team to the next level? We discussed a lot on this podcast, what they've already done, what they plan to do in the draft. In your mind, if you could narrow it down to, I don't know, one thing or something, sure, what's going to take this team to the next level?
The biggest thing to me is the Bills, and they've already done this, I think, or this has become a priority, is they need to get more explosive everywhere. That they have had all of these great scheme fits, and Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde, certainly in their primes, were quality athletes. But even Trey White was never a 4-3 guy out at corner. And you saw that in some games when there was Levi Wallace on the field with Tyreek Hill, there was just too much of a mismatch. And then over the past couple of seasons, for as good and as deep as the defensive line has been, and the ascension of Gregory Rousseau, it's really been like Ed Oliver as, like we're mentioning, the big time traits guy. AJ Epinesa doesn't have quality traits. If you're looking at just comparing him to other edge rushers, they've had some bottom of the roster players like Quentin Jefferson and Jordan Phillips plugging that one technique spot. I think this offseason with Michael Hoyt, with Joey Bosa, Josh Palmer, who certainly has explosiveness, I think they want and need to get more explosive on defense and on offense. And for as much as I am on board with Kenneth Grant, because I think that at 6'3" and 330 pounds, he's about as explosive as you're going to get at nose tackle. If they went someone completely different size-wise at defensive tackle, a Walter Nolan, someone who can just get up the field along with Ed Oliver, or add an edge rusher that might be a little undersized, but can win in under 2.5 seconds to get to the quarterback, I think that puts this very well coached, very fundamentally sound Bills roster and Bills team over the hump, because I think that's been the one thing that's been slightly missing over the last 4 or 5 years, where they've otherwise been, the second most accomplished team in the NFL in terms of wins and point differential. They're at the top. They need more explosiveness and speed on offense and on defense.
And I mentioned it in the latest issue of Bills Digest. This team is on the precipice of greatness, and Brandon Beane has done a great job setting this team up to get to this point. But like you mentioned, they need a couple of those chess pieces to take them over the edge. And you look at this offense, beyond Josh Allen, James Cook is really the next best player in terms of explosiveness and big play ability. So I think you need to bring something in there. And then obviously on defense, that was kind of their weak point last year. So Chris, I appreciate you taking the time and giving the people your knowledge. I'm sure you'll be on One Bills Live coming up here soon, but why don't you tell the people where they can find your work on CBS? I believe you usually direct people just to search your name on there.
Yeah, just what I always say is just Google CBS Sports, Chris Trapasso, and then the first Google result will be my archive. So I would push you in that direction if you want to read any more of my stuff. And I will be on One Bills Live co-hosting with Chris Brown this upcoming Friday, where I can just completely nerd out and rattle off as many prospects and scouting reports and comparisons that I have in my head, because I don't want to waste this knowledge. And I know that's a thing, that I'm going to watch 300 players and there's going to be guys that never make it in the NFL that I have scouting reports on. So here, thank you for letting me do that. And then when I go on One Bills Live, I will try to answer any calls and dive as deep as we can as we get in and lead into draft month in April.
Yeah, we love Chris Brown on this program, a friend of the program, and I'm sure you two will nerd out together for 3 hours, I believe, rather than 30 minutes. So it will really be a draft extravaganza. Join them on Friday. But Chris, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, very grateful that Chris was able to join us here today. Before we get out of here, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Forefathers Organics in Dansville. At Forefathers Organics, their mission is to liberate, educate, and innovate with the highest quality CBD and hemp-derived products for your mind, body, and soul, so you can live happy and free. Visit them at 87 Franklin Street in Dansville, online at forefathersorganics.com, or call them at 585-335-2223 to learn more about the products they offer. All right, I'll leave you with one final thought. Chris touched on it there at the end of his thoughts. Kenneth Grant, another player that I've crushed on throughout this early draft process here. Actually, not really early anymore with the draft less than a month away. But Kenneth Grant, the explosiveness he can provide on the inside, and really that run-stopping ability. Does have that ability to rush the passer as well from inside. I believe 6.5 sacks last year from Michigan. But his run-stuffing ability on the inside, and that is something I think that is holding Ed Oliver back from reaching his next level of production. You saw it last year, or 2 years ago, excuse me, a career year for Ed Oliver. Maybe a little bit more talent beside him on the interior of the Bills' offense or defensive line. But this year, with Daquan Jones really taking a nosedive in terms of his production and getting up there in age as well, I think you need to find that next piece to put there beside Ed Oliver, allow that player to eat some blocks, stuff some runs up the middle, and allow Ed Oliver to flourish in what he does best, and that's really getting up the field, as Chris mentioned, and getting into the backfield and putting pressure on opposing quarterbacks. He did that so well during the 2023 campaign, fell off a little bit in 2024, dealt with some injury trouble. He needs to get back to that next level. As, again, Chris mentioned, he's one of the very few players on this defense with that game-wrecking ability. And in order to unlock that, I think you need to get a player beside him. And I think Kenneth Grant could come right in and be that player for the Buffalo Bills if they're able to get him at number 30, or perhaps a minimal trade up a few spots to land him late in the first round. Another player on the inside, Derek Harmon out of Oregon. I've talked about both of these players before. I just want to continue to reiterate that those are the two players that I would be targeting for the Bills in the interior defensive line if I'm looking at that position in round one come April 24th. But I also wouldn't put it past them to go, like I said, cornerback, a position of need, and then edge rusher as well. I know you bring in a Joey Bosa, you bring in a Michael Hoyt trying to satisfy that position, but you need to set yourself up for the future. And I'm not sure Javon Solomon, AJ Epinesa, Greg Rousseau really are the group that's going to carry you over the edge. I think you need to add to that position, and you need to look to edge rusher perhaps at the top end of the draft as well as another option. And I don't think you can take your eye off of Trey Hendrickson, but I think as time goes on, you sign Bosa, you signed Hoyt. I just think that becomes less of an opportunity. And you hear about the high price tag that the Bengals are putting on Trey Hendrickson. I just don't think the Bills are going to go down that road at this point, unless something breaks differently over the next few weeks or months. Maybe the Bengals can't come to terms with him. I know they just signed those 2 wide receivers to long-term deals and spent a lot of money doing so. So I'm not sure that the Bills would be able to do that, but certainly I would not stray away from that if that was an opportunity. As far as the draft is concerned, the Bills met with Landon Jackson, the Arkansas edge rusher, at the NFL scouting combine. So certainly a player that the Bills have on their mind, and a player that I think would be a good fit here, worth targeting at the end of the first round. He tested off the charts at the combine, a really athletic player. And you heard Chris talk about the traits. Landon Jackson is a player with a lot of those traits that can provide a burst off the edge and be a potential game wrecker for this Bills team. But that's going to do it for today's podcast. I'd like to thank you for joining me, and we will see you. Oh, I want to get to one comment. Keith, my man, Alex Brasky, son of my all-time favorite PE teacher and basketball coach, my father, still doing it in his final year as PE teacher at Batavia High School, heading off into the sunset with retirement at the end of this year, but he will continue to coach basketball. So if you'd like to see him on the hardwood, be sure to stop by State Street in Batavia. But once again, we'd like to thank you for joining us, and we will see you